Henry Morrison stood frozen at his stone fence, his 72-year-old hands trembling against the weathered rocks. 20 feet away, a female cheetah with a crescent-shaped scar watched him with ancient, knowing eyes. She wasn't hunting. She wasn't defending territory. She was simply standing in the exact spot where Eleanor used to scatter feed for the wild ones. Before cancer took her 5 years ago, the cheetah's ribs showed through her spotted coat, her body trembling with dehydration, yet she wouldn't touch the stream nearby. Her amber eyes weren't looking at Henry. They were looking through him, searching for someone who would never return. "Eleanor," Henry whispered to the photograph in his chest pocket, his wedding ring catching the dying light. The cheetah made a sound then, not a growl, not a threat, but something that transcended species. A question, a plea, a memory calling across the impossible divide between human and beast. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Henry Morrison had once been somebody. Director of the Wild Heart Conservation Center, a man with purpose and vision. Born in Hartford, Connecticut, he'd spent 30 years building a life in southern Spain with Eleanor, the veterinarian who'd stolen his heart at a wildlife conference in Denver. Now, 5 years after pancreatic cancer claimed her in just 3 months, he was a ghost haunting his own existence. The remote property sat 4 miles from the abandoned conservation center that bankruptcy had shuttered 8 years ago. The stone fence Eleanor had built with her own hands still stood strong, unlike everything else that seemed to crumble in her absence. Her garden, once bursting with medicinal herbs she'd cultivated for treating wounded animals, lay barren and accusing under the Spanish sun. The old veterinary shed remained untouched, its door slightly ajar. Medical supplies gathering dust on shelves that once witnessed miracles. Every morning, Henry performed the same ritual, brewing coffee for 2. Setting out Eleanor's favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle and the faded image of a cheetah, beside his own. He'd read the newspaper aloud, commenting on stories as if she sat across from him, her reading glasses perched on her nose, occasionally humming her disagreement or approval. The glasses still rested on her nightstand, next to a half-finished crossword puzzle dated 5 years ago. Evenings found him in what remained of Eleanor's garden, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching the sun paint the rocky hills where cheetahs once roamed freely during the conservation center's glory days. His nearest neighbor, Martha Henderson, a 68-year-old widow herself, lived 5 miles east but might as well have been on another continent for all the human contact Henry sought. The house had become a museum of interrupted life. Eleanor's last grocery list remained magnetized to the refrigerator. Her shoes sat by the door as if she'd just stepped out. Her final written note, discovered a week after her death, still lay in his wallet. "Feed Grace if she returns." He'd never known who Grace was. Eleanor had hundreds of names for the creatures she'd saved over the years. Guilt ate at him like acid. The conservation project hadn't just run out of funding. It had failed because of his decisions, his compromises, his signatures on documents he should have questioned. Now he lived in self-imposed exile, a 72-year-old man speaking to shadows and pouring coffee for ghosts. Day 1, the evening of March 15th, began like every other, until 5:47 p.m. shattered Henry's carefully constructed routine. He was washing his single dinner plate when movement beyond the kitchen window stopped his hands mid-scrub. There, at the stone fence, exactly where Eleanor used to scatter evening feed for the wild creatures, stood a cheetah. Henry's first instinct was primal fear. His hand reached for the rifle mounted beside the door, a relic from the conservation center days when they'd needed protection from poachers, not wildlife. But something in the animal's posture made him pause. This wasn't the coiled tension of a predator stalking prey. The cheetah simply stood, statuesque, her amber eyes fixed on the house with an intensity that seemed almost purposeful. She was female. That much was clear from her smaller frame, and older. Henry could tell by the slight gray around her muzzle, the way her shoulders carried the weight of years. But it was the scar that made his breath catch a distinctive crescent shape across her left shoulder, silver against the spotted coat. She was desperately thin, ribs visible even from this distance, yet she made no move toward the chickens pecking in the yard. Henry stepped onto the porch, expecting her to bolt. "Go on," he shouted, waving his arms. "Get out of here." The cheetah didn't even flinch. She remained perfectly still, as if she'd been carved from the dying light itself. He threw a small stone in her direction, not to hit, just to startle. It landed near her paws. She looked down at it, then back at him, unmoving, unnerved. Henry retreated inside, double-checking the locks. Through the window, he watched her maintain her vigil as darkness fell. When he checked at midnight, moonlight revealed her still there, a spectral sentinel at his fence. When dawn broke on day 2, she was gone. That second evening, March 16th, at exactly 5:47 p.m., she returned. Same spot, same posture. But now Henry noticed what he'd missed before the telltale signs of severe dehydration. Her eyes slightly sunken, her breathing labored despite the cool evening air. The creek ran just 50 yards from where she stood, yet she made no move toward it. Henry filled a large bowl with water, approaching slowly. "You're thirsty, aren't you?" He said it halfway between the house and her position, then retreated. She watched him but wouldn't approach the bowl, not even when he went inside. Through the window, he saw her look at the water with what seemed like longing, but she never moved. Frustrated and concerned, Henry called Martha Henderson. "There's a cheetah at my fence," he said without preamble. Martha's voice carried surprise but not disbelief. "The one with the scar. You've seen her. Passed by yesterday on my way to town. Just standing there, like she's waiting for something. Or someone." There was a pause. "Henry, wild animals don't just stand around like that unless they remember something." Maybe she knew Eleanor. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. Martha's words echoed as he found himself in Eleanor's study, pulling out her old journals. She'd kept meticulous records of every animal she'd treated. His fingers trembled as he turned pages filled with her handwriting, each entry a small resurrection of her voice. Then he found it, dated 10 years ago, March 20th. "Rescued a young female cheetah today from a poacher's wire snare. Terrible wound on her left shoulder, will leave a crescent scar. Such dignity in her suffering. Never once tried to bite as I cleaned the wound. I've named her Grace. She has grace despite her pain. Released her after 3 weeks of treatment. She let me touch her head before she ran back to freedom. I hope she finds her way." Day 3 arrived with crystalline clarity. Henry compared Eleanor's sketches to the cheetah at his fence. Every detail matched the scar's exact curve, the distinctive spot pattern on her face, even the slight notch in her right ear. His legs gave out, and he sat hard on the porch steps. "Grace," he whispered. The cheetah's ears swiveled toward his voice. Henry stumbled back inside, returning with Eleanor's old veterinary vest, the one she'd never let him wash, claiming the animal sense calmed her patience. He approached slowly, holding it out. Grace's nostrils flared. She took one step forward, then stopped, her eyes moving from the vest to the spot where Eleanor used to stand, then back to Henry. In that moment, Henry understood. Grace wasn't here for herself. The desperate look in her eyes wasn't just thirst or hunger. She was asking for something more. The morning of day 3 brought revelation and horror in equal measure. Henry had spent the night watching Grace through the window, noting how her gaze never wavered from a fixed point beyond the house. She wasn't looking at where Eleanor used to stand. She was looking through it, toward the hills where the old creek wound through the property, following her line of sight like a compass needle. Henry walked the familiar path Eleanor had loved, the one she'd called her thinking trail. The creek that had babbled cheerfully for 30 years now ran sluggish and wrong, its color slightly off, an oily sheen catching the morning light. The smell hit him next, chemical, sharp, utterly foreign to this wild place. His boots squelched in mud that shouldn't have been there in the dry season. Pushing through the overgrown brush, he found them 3 industrial barrels, partially buried in a collapsed section of the embankment. The Conservation Center's logo was still visible beneath rust and dirt. His stomach turned to ice as he read the faded hazmat symbols. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone, photographing the serial numbers. Back at the house, he searched through boxes of conservation center records he'd kept in the attic. The documentation was there, damning in black and white. Temporary storage of veterinary chemical waste, pending proper disposal. Location North Creek Auxiliary Site, authorized by Henry Morrison, Director. He remembered the meeting now, the budget shortfall, the disposal company's quote that would have meant laying off staff. "It's just temporary," he'd said. "We'll move them next quarter when the grant comes through." But the grant never came. The center closed, and he'd forgotten about 3 barrels of death slowly poisoning the water table. Martha arrived at noon with her nephew, Tom Bradley, a 45-year-old environmental engineer visiting from Phoenix. Tom was everything Henry wasn't. Tall, confident, still believing the world's problems had solutions. He took water samples with professional efficiency, his expression darkening with each test. "This is beyond contamination," Tom announced, holding up a test strip that had turned an alarming shade of purple. "We're talking about heavy metals, possibly organophosphates. The entire water table for 3 miles could be compromised. How long have these barrels been here?" 8 years, Henry whispered. Tom's expression shifted from professional concern to barely contained anger. 8 years. We need to call the authorities immediately. EPA, local environmental protection, everyone. No, Henry said sharply. They'll come in force. They'll see Grace. They'll tranquilize her, cage her, and she'll die in some facility. Mr. Morrison, with all due respect, a wild cheetah isn't supposed to be here anyway. Spain hasn't had wild cheetahs in centuries. She's probably an escaped exotic pet, or she's not a pet. Henry's voice cracked. Eleanor saved her. She trusts us. She came here for help. Martha stepped between them. Tom, please, let's think about this carefully. Think, Martha. We're talking about groundwater contamination. Other animals drink from this creek. People have wells downstream. The nearest well is 10 miles south, Henry said. The contamination flows north into uninhabited land. That you know of, Tom countered. This requires immediate action. Their argument was interrupted by a low sound from outside. Grace had moved closer to the house, and in the harsh afternoon light, they could all see what Henry had missed before. Her belly was swollen, not with illness but with life. She was pregnant, heavily so. Dear God, Martha breathed. She's about to give birth. Tom's demeanor shifted slightly. How long is gestation for cheetahs? About 3 months, Henry recalled from Eleanor's books. She looks close, maybe days. Then we definitely need professional help, veterinary support, proper facilities. She didn't come here for a veterinary hospital, Henry interrupted. She came here for Eleanor. She remembered the one person who helped her without caging her, who let her go free. She's asking for that same trust. Grace swayed slightly, catching herself. The dehydration was winning. Her breathing had become more labored, and she'd started trembling despite the warm afternoon. She'll die without intervention, Tom said quietly. The cubs, too. Eleanor would have found another way, Henry muttered, more to himself than the others. Martha placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Then think like Eleanor, not like Henry. What would she do? Henry found himself back in Eleanor's veterinary shed, tearing through her files with desperate purpose. Eleanor had been unconventional, brilliant in ways that formal veterinary training couldn't teach. She'd learned from indigenous wildlife handlers, desert nomads, anyone who understood animals beyond textbooks. Come on, Eleanor, he pleaded with the dusty air. Help me! In a leather journal marked Theoretical Treatments, he found it. Pages of notes about desert animal adaptations, about how certain species could absorb moisture through their skin in extreme circumstances. Eleanor had hypothesized that cheetahs, with their thin skin and specialized circulation, might be capable of dermal hydration in crisis situations. She'd drawn diagrams of misting systems, calculations of water droplet size, absorption rates. It was never tested, she'd written. Too radical for publication, but if a cheetah was dying of dehydration and couldn't or wouldn't drink contaminated water, this might be the only way. Tom read over his shoulder, skepticism clear on his face. This is pseudoscience at best. You're talking about trying to hydrate a large mammal through its skin. Eleanor wasn't a fool, Martha said firmly. If she wrote it, she had reasons. Based on what hope desperation? Henry looked out at Grace, who had finally lain down, her strength failing. Based on 30 years of saving animals everyone else gave up on. Based on understanding that sometimes the unconventional answer is the only answer. He gathered the garden sprayers Eleanor had used for her herbs, checking their mechanisms. I need clean water. Lots of it. The nearest clean source is the mountain spring, Tom said. That's a 3-hour hike up rough terrain. Then I'd better get started, Henry replied, already gathering containers. You're 72 years old, Martha protested. Your knees can barely handle the stairs. Eleanor was 67 when she crawled through thorns to save an injured fox. Age is just an excuse for giving up. Tom sighed, the fight leaving him. If we're doing this insane thing, we're doing it right. I'll help carry water, but if she gets worse, we call for help. Deal. Henry looked at Grace through the window. She was watching the house, waiting with the patience of the wild, trusting in a promise made 10 years ago by hands that could no longer keep it. Deal, he said, knowing he was lying. Day 4 dawned gray and cool, matching Henry's exhaustion. He'd managed 3 hours of fitful sleep on the porch, wrapped in Eleanor's old quilt, maintaining visual contact with Grace. She hadn't moved from her spot near the fence, though her breathing had become more labored during the night. The morning light revealed the true extent of her condition. Her coat had lost its luster. Her eyes were becoming clouded, and she swayed slightly even while lying down. Henry positioned himself 30 feet from her, settling onto an overturned bucket with Eleanor's journals in his lap. If Grace wouldn't let him approach physically, perhaps he could reach her another way. March 22nd, 2014. He read aloud, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. Grace's wound is healing beautifully. She allows me to change her bandages without sedation now. Today she ate from my hand. Such a privilege to earn a wild creature's trust. Grace's ears swiveled toward his voice. Her head lifted slightly. Henry continued reading, entry after entry about Grace's recovery. Eleanor's words painted a picture of a remarkable relationship, a wild cheetah who'd learned to trust one specific human without losing her essential wildness. As the sun climbed higher, Henry noticed Grace's breathing had steadied slightly. She was listening. From his phone, he played a video from Eleanor's birthday 5 years ago. Her laugh rang out across the yard, that distinctive giggle snort she'd always been embarrassed about. Grace's entire body tensed, then relaxed. She raised her head fully, looking around as if expecting Eleanor to materialize. She's not coming, Henry said softly. I'm sorry. Grace, she's gone. But I'm here, and I'm trying to understand what you need. He began humming, tunelessly at first, then finding the melody Eleanor had always used with frightened animals. Amazing Grace. His voice cracked on the high notes. Nothing like Eleanor's clear soprano, but Grace's eyes focused on him with something that might have been recognition. By noon, Grace had closed the distance to 20 feet. Progress, but not enough. Her dehydration was becoming critical. Tom returned from town with water testing equipment and worse news. I've mapped the contamination spread using ground-penetrating radar I borrowed from the university, he explained, spreading charts across Henry's kitchen table. It's not just the creek. The entire underground water table is contaminated for at least 3 miles in every direction. Every water source within Grace's natural range would be poison to her. How did she know? Martha wondered. Animals can usually smell or taste contamination, but not always before it's too late. Cheetahs have exceptional chemical detection, Henry said, remembering Eleanor's lectures. They can sense prey hormones from miles away. She probably detected the contamination before taking a single sip. The only clean source is the mountain spring at Crow's Peak, Tom continued. It's fed from a different watershed entirely. But that's a 3-hour hike each way over rough terrain, and we'd need at least 20 gallons to start Eleanor's misting treatment, plus ongoing supply. Then we go, Henry said simply. Mr. Morrison, be realistic. You're old, tired, guilty. Henry stood, his knees protesting. Yes, I'm all of those things. I'm all. But Grace traveled God knows how far, while pregnant and dying of thirst, to find the one place Eleanor promised would be safe. I signed the papers that poisoned her world. The least I can do is carry some water. Martha insisted on coming, as did Tom, though he grumbled about liability and lawsuits the entire first mile. The trail was worse than Henry remembered. Winter storms had washed out sections, and fallen trees created obstacles that his younger self would have vaulted but now required careful navigation. He fell twice, the second time opening a gash on his palm that bled freely. We should go back, Tom said when they finally reached the spring. You need medical attention. Henry was already filling containers, his blood mixing with the pristine water. Grace needs this more than I need stitches. The return journey took 4 hours. Henry managed to carry 5 gallons, though his body screamed with every step. When they finally reached the house, Grace had moved closer to the porch, drawn perhaps by the scent of truly clean water. Using Eleanor's old garden sprayers, Henry created a fine mist around Grace's resting area. The cheetah didn't run. As the microscopic droplets settled on her coat, she closed her eyes and began to purr, a deep rumbling sound Henry had only read about in Eleanor's journals. It's working, Martha whispered. But Tom, ever practical, shook his head. 5 gallons isn't enough. She needs continuous hydration, especially if she's about to give birth. We need help. Help came from unexpected sources. That evening, Martha called her church group, ostensibly for prayers, but really to spread the word about Henry's situation. By the next morning, day 5, the quiet man who'd isolated himself for 5 years found his property invaded by the curious, the concerned, and the conflicted. You're harboring a dangerous animal, declared James Patterson, a local rancher who'd lost sheep to wild dogs and blamed every predator equally. What happens when it recovers and decides your chickens look tasty, or Martha's grandchildren? She's not staying, Henry explained patiently. Once she's hydrated and the cubs are born safely, she'll return to the wild. Cubs, Patterson's voice rose. You're talking about multiple dangerous animals. They're babies, Martha interjected. Innocent creatures who didn't choose to be born into a poisoned world. The argument might have escalated, but Father Miguel Santos arrived then. At 70, the priest commanded respect even from skeptics like Patterson. He walked directly to where Grace lay, stopping just outside her comfort zone, and stood in silent observation for several minutes. I see suffering, he finally said, and I see a creature seeking sanctuary. Didn't Christ say, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me? Christ wasn't talking about predators, Patterson shot back. Wasn't he? Father Miguel smiled gently. Perhaps predators are only dangerous when we give them no choice but to be. Sheriff Robert Cole arrived that afternoon, his official vehicle raising dust and Henry's blood pressure simultaneously. At 55, Cole was a practical man who preferred easy solutions to complicated problems, and a pregnant cheetah on private property was definitely complicated. Henry, he began, his tone officially neutral. I've had 3 calls about a dangerous animal on your property. You know I have to investigate. She's not dangerous, Henry said, moving protectively between Cole and Grace's resting spot. She's dying. Cole looked past him to where Grace lay, the misting system creating rainbow halos in the afternoon sun. That's a cheetah. Yes. An African cheetah. In Spain. On your property. She was rescued here 10 years ago, treated by Eleanor, and released. She's returned because she needs help. It's illegal to harbor exotic animals without proper permits. Then arrest me, Henry said flatly, but do it after she's safe. Cole studied him for a long moment. You know, I could have animal control here in an hour. They'd tranquilize her, take her to a facility, where she'd die, Henry interrupted. Stressed, caged, away from anything familiar. Eleanor saved her once without cages or chains. I'm trying to do the same. The law doesn't care about your wife's methods. Morrison? Henry's composure finally cracked. The law. You want to talk about the law. The law said those chemical barrels were stored legally. The law said the conservation center's closure was handled properly. The law let me poison 3 miles of groundwater because I had the right signatures on the right forms. His voice rose with each word. You know what else was legal once slavery? Keeping the wrong religion. Turning away refugees. Sometimes, Sheriff, the law and what's right are on opposite sides of the fence. Don't compare this to... I'm comparing it to exactly what it is. A choice between bureaucratic convenience and moral necessity. That cheetah trusted a human once and was freed. She's trusting humans again. And you want to cage her? The confrontation drew a crowd. Neighbors who'd maintained careful distance from the grieving widower now stood witness to his passionate defense. Some nodded agreement. Others looked scandalized. Mr. Morrison, Cole said carefully, you're asking me to ignore my duty. I'm asking you to remember that duty and law aren't always the same thing. Eleanor understood that. She never asked permission to save a life. Father Miguel stepped forward. Sheriff, if I may, the Morrison property is private land, unless the animal poses an immediate threat to public safety. Isn't this a civil matter? A cheetah is an immediate threat by definition. Is she? Miguel gestured to where Grace lay. She can barely stand. She's made no aggressive moves. She's seeking help, not hunting. Sarah Williams arrived then, a 24-year-old veterinary student whose timing seemed providential. Sheriff Cole, I'm Sarah Williams. My grandmother was Dorothy Campbell. Everyone knew Dorothy Campbell, the town matriarch who'd run the animal shelter for 40 years before her retirement. Her word still carried weight, even secondhand. Grandmother knew Mrs. Morrison well, Sarah continued. She always said Eleanor had a gift with wild animals that couldn't be taught in schools. I'm here to observe and assist if needed. Strictly unofficial, of course. Cole looked from Sarah to Henry to the growing crowd. I never saw anything, he finally said. I responded to calls about a possible wild animal, investigated, and found no immediate threat to public safety. But Morrison, he fixed Henry with a stern look. If anyone gets hurt, if that animal attacks anything or anyone, I'll come back with a full team. Understood? Understood. As Cole's vehicle disappeared, Sarah approached Henry. May I examine her? I brought equipment. With Henry maintaining a calming presence, reading more of Eleanor's journals aloud, Sarah conducted her examination using a telephoto lens and observational diagnosis. She's definitely in late-stage pregnancy, she confirmed. Based on her size and the position, I'd say twins at minimum, possibly triplets. And they're coming soon, within 48 hours. Can she survive delivery in her condition? Sarah hesitated. With continuous hydration and if she trusts us enough to let us help? Maybe. But, Mr. Morrison, if something goes wrong during delivery, she could attack. Maternal instinct overrides everything else. Eleanor delivered dozens of cubs from various species, Henry said. Her notes are extensive. We can do this. That evening brought unexpected support. As darkness fell, Henry found water containers at his gate. No note, no identification. Throughout the night, more appeared. Someone left a battery-powered camping shower that could be converted to a misting system. Another anonymous donor provided medical supplies with a note for Eleanor's memory. Day 6 arrived with Grace showing marked improvement from the constant misting, but also signs of impending labor. She'd begun nesting, pulling grass and leaves into a pile, her breathing changing rhythm periodically. It's happening, Sarah observed. We need to prepare for intervention if necessary. Henry set up a makeshift shelter using tarps and poles, creating a semi-enclosed space that would give Grace privacy while allowing observation. Tom Bradley, despite his initial skepticism, had become invested in the outcome. He'd spent the morning running calculations on water needs and misting rates, optimizing the system for maximum efficiency. "You know," Tom said as they worked, "I thought you were just a crazy old man when this started. And now I think you're a crazy old man doing something extraordinary." Martha had organized what she called Grace's Guardians, volunteers who would maintain round-the-clock water runs to the mountain spring. Even James Patterson, the skeptical rancher, had quietly joined the water brigade, though he maintained his grumbling about fool notions loud enough for anyone to hear. As the sun set on day 6, Grace's contractions began in earnest. Henry positioned himself where she could see him. Eleanor's journal open in his lap, reading the entries about Grace's original recovery. "You were so brave then," he told her. "Eleanor wrote that you never complained, never gave up, even when the pain must have been unbearable. She said you had more dignity than most humans she knew." His voice broke slightly. "She would be so proud to see you now, fighting for your babies the way you once fought for your own life." Grace looked at him, and in that moment, Henry could have sworn he saw recognition, not just of him, but of Eleanor's spirit working through him. "We're going to get through this," he promised her. "You came to the right place. Eleanor's still here in every lesson she taught, every life she saved. Tomorrow, you're going to bring new life into this world, and we're going to make sure it's a world worth living in." As if in response, Grace's purr rumbled through the night air, a sound of trust that transcended species, echoing off the stone fence Eleanor had built, and filling the space where love refused to die. The vigil had begun. Henry wrapped himself in Eleanor's quilt, settling in for what would be the longest night of his life since the one he'd lost her. Around him, the unlikely community of Grace's guardians took their positions. Tom monitored the misting system. Sarah prepared medical supplies. Martha coordinated volunteers, and Father Miguel led a quiet prayer in the darkness. "Eleanor," Henry whispered to the stars, "I know you're watching. Help us. Help Grace. Show me how to be the person you always believed I could be." In her shelter, Grace's labor intensified, her body preparing for the ancient struggle of bringing life into a broken world. The mountain spring water continued its healing mist, each droplet carrying the promise that sometimes love finds a way to flow even through poisoned ground. The first contraction hit at 3:07 a.m. on day 7, pulling Grace from her fitful rest with a guttural sound that sent Henry scrambling from his makeshift bed on the porch. The darkness was absolute. Clouds having rolled in during the night to obscure the stars Eleanor used to name for him during their insomniac wanderings. Grace was panting, her sides heaving with a rhythm that Henry recognized from Eleanor's detailed notes. He grabbed his phone with trembling fingers, the screen's harsh light momentarily blinding him. "Martha," he said when she answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. "It's happening. I'm bringing help," she said simply, already moving. Henry approached Grace slowly, maintaining the 30-foot distance she'd established as her comfort zone. In the beam of his flashlight, he could see her dilated eyes, the way her body tensed with each wave of contractions. She was trying to stand, instinct telling her to move, but her dehydration-weakened legs wouldn't support her weight. "Easy, girl," Henry murmured, starting the portable misting system Tom had rigged the night before. "Easy now. Eleanor went through this too, you know. Not with a baby that lived. But she understood. She wrote about it. Said bringing life into the world was the closest humans could come to touching the divine." Grace's response was another contraction, stronger this time. She managed to shift positions, turning so Henry could see the beginning of delivery. His flashlight caught the emergence of a tiny paw, then pulled back as Grace's body seized with effort. Martha arrived at 3:45, bringing Father Miguel and, surprisingly, Tom Bradley, who looked both terrified and determined. Sarah Williams pulled up moments later, her car loaded with veterinary supplies she'd borrowed from the university clinic. "First cub is coming," Henry reported, his voice tight with anxiety. "But something's wrong. It's been 20 minutes since I saw the paw." Sarah moved closer than anyone else dared, using binoculars with night vision she'd somehow procured. The cub's positioned correctly, but Grace is too weak. She needs help. But if we intervene directly, she might attack. "Then we don't intervene directly," Father Miguel said quietly. "We support her effort." More vehicles arrived as word spread through Martha's phone tree. Dorothy Campbell herself, 80 years old and supposedly bedridden with arthritis, emerged from her grandson's truck with a determined expression that brooked no argument. "Delivered hundreds of animals in my time," she declared, approaching Henry. "The mother needs encouragement. Talk to her. Morrison, she came to you for a reason." Henry moved closer, now only 15 feet from Grace. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice carrying the weight of every conversation he'd had with Eleanor's memory. "I know it hurts, but you're the strongest creature Eleanor ever knew. She wrote that you had more courage in your smallest claw than most humans have in their entire bodies." Grace looked at him, her amber eyes holding his as another contraction racked her frame. Then, with an effort that seemed to pull from reserve she shouldn't have had, she pushed. The first cub emerged in a rush of fluid, landing on the prepared bedding Sarah had scattered, but it wasn't moving. "No," Henry breathed, starting forward, but Sarah held him back. "Wait," she commanded, already coaching him. "The mother needs to clean it. If she can't—" Grace tried to reach her cub, but her position and weakness made it impossible. She looked at Henry with an expression of such desperate pleading that 40 years of marriage hadn't prepared him to refuse. "Tell me what to do," he said to Sarah, already moving. "Gentle compressions on the chest, 2 fingers only, like this." Sarah demonstrated on her own hand. "Clear the airway first." Henry approached the tiny form, no bigger than his hand. Grace watched but didn't threaten, seeming to understand his intent. The cub was perfect in miniature, spotted coat slick with birth, tiny claws already formed, but its chest was still, following Sarah's instructions. Henry cleared mucus from the impossibly small mouth, then began compressions with 2 fingers. "Come on, little one. Your mother traveled miles to give you a chance. Eleanor would say every life is a miracle waiting to happen. Don't make liars of them both." 30 compressions. Nothing. 60. Still nothing. "Please," Henry whispered, and he wasn't sure if he was talking to the cub, to God, or to Eleanor. On the 73rd compression, the tiny chest expanded on its own. A weak cry, barely audible, emerged from the smallest lungs Henry had ever seen work. Grace responded immediately, her entire body seeming to gain strength from that sound. "Thank God," someone murmured, and Henry realized a crowd had gathered. 20, maybe 30 people standing in silent witness to this impossible moment. Sheriff Cole's cruiser pulled up, the officer emerging in civilian clothes. "I'm off duty," he announced to anyone who might question his presence, then grabbed a water container from his trunk. "Where do you need this?" The first cub was breathing steadily now, Grace able to reach it for cleaning per trace, but her contractions hadn't stopped. The second was coming. That's when the wind picked up. Tom Bradley checked his phone's weather app, his face paling in the screen's glow. "Storm system coming in fast. Wasn't supposed to hit until tomorrow." "How long?" Henry asked. 20 minutes, maybe less." "We need shelter," Sarah said urgently. "If the cubs get wet and cold right after birth—" The community moved as one. Without discussion or designated leadership, they formed a human chain, passing materials from trucks and sheds. James Patterson, the rancher who'd complained the loudest about dangerous animals, held one corner of a tarp. Sheriff Cole anchored another. Father Miguel blessed the makeshift structure as it took shape. A combination of tarps, poles, and determination creating a wind barrier around Grace. The second cub came as the first fat raindrops began to fall. This one emerged more easily. Grace having found her rhythm, it was larger than the first, clearly male, and announced his arrival with a cry that sounded almost indignant at the circumstances of his birth. But Grace was fading. The effort had cost her everything, and Sarah's expression as she watched through binoculars was grim. There's definitely a third, but she's exhausted. If it doesn't come soon. Thunder crashed overhead, the storm arriving with vindictive fury. The tarps whipped and threatened to tear away, but the human chain held. In the periodic lightning flashes, Henry could see faces he'd ignored for 5 years. Neighbors who'd tried to reach out after Eleanor's death. People he'd rebuffed in his grief. They were all here now, soaking in the rain, protecting a wild animal none of them had any obligation to help. "She's not pushing," Sarah called over the storm. "The third cub is stuck." "What do we do?" Henry asked, though he suspected the answer. "Someone has to reposition it manually. It requires reaching inside, finding the cub, turning it." Sarah looked at him steadily. "It requires absolute trust from the mother. One wrong move, one moment of fear, and she'll attack with everything she has left." Henry didn't hesitate. He moved to Grace's side, placing one hand on her heaving flank. She turned her head to look at him, and in that moment, lit by lightning, he saw not just a suffering animal but a mother fighting for her children, a living connection to Eleanor, a test of everything he claimed to believe about redemption. "Grace," he said, his voice somehow carrying over the storm. "Eleanor saved you once. She pulled 37 thorns from your paws after you ran through that burned section. Remember, you let her touch your wounds then. Let me help you now." He began to sing, his voice cracking and off-key, but the melody unmistakable. Amazing Grace. Eleanor's song, their wedding song, the song she'd hummed while dying in his arms. Grace's body relaxed marginally, following Sarah's precise instructions. Henry reached into the birth canal, his hand finding the third cub. It was breech, turned sideways, impossible to deliver without intervention. "Gentle rotation," Sarah coached. "Clockwise, slowly." The intimacy of the moment was profound. His hand inside this wild creature, literally holding her future, while she trusted him with the faith that humans rarely showed each other. The cub turned gradually, Henry feeling the tiny limbs repositioning. "Now guide it down," Sarah instructed. "Don't pull, just guide." Lightning illuminated the scene as the third cub emerged, smaller than the others, female, with a distinctive white spot on her forehead that made Dorothy Campbell gasp. "Just like the pictures," she said. "Eleanor showed me photos of Grace as a cub. That same marking." But the third cub wasn't breathing, and Grace was too exhausted to help. Without prompting, the crowd formed a protective circle, blocking the worst of the wind as Henry worked on the tiny form. This time, he didn't count compressions. He simply worked with the mechanical persistence of love, refusing to accept defeat. Sheriff Cole found himself holding Henry's flashlight, aiming it steady despite the storm. Father Miguel prayed in Spanish, the ancient words mixing with thunder. Tom Bradley managed the misting system one-handed while shielding the cubs with his body. Martha sang, her voice joining Henry's in the hymn. The smallest cub drew breath just as the storm began to break, her cry thin but determined. Grace managed to raise her head, looking at her 3 offspring with an expression that transcended species, pure maternal love mixed with exhaustion that had nearly killed her. "You did it," Henry told her, tears mixing with rain on his weathered face. 3 perfect cubs. Eleanor would be so proud. I'm so proud." Grace looked at him, then did something extraordinary. She reached out with one paw, placing it on his hand, the same gesture she'd made with Eleanor 10 years ago, documented in the journal Henry had read so many times. The storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind the fresh smell of rain on earth and the sound of 3 tiny cheetahs mewing for their mother. Grace, despite her exhaustion, managed to position herself to nurse them, her body curved protective around these impossible miracles. "Nobody's ever going to believe this," someone said. Sheriff Cole cleared his throat. "Believe what? I wasn't here. None of us were. Just a storm that passed through. Nothing official to report. Amen, Father Miguel added. Though I think God might have been watching. Dorothy Campbell approached Henry as he sat in the mud, exhausted beyond measure. Your Eleanor would have been proud of you tonight. Henry Morrison. You honored her memory in the best way possible, by choosing compassion over fear. Henry couldn't speak. He watched Grace tend to her cubs, the smallest one with the white spot seeming particularly vigorous despite her dramatic entrance. The community that had gathered began to disperse slowly, but not before each person stopped to look at the new family, to witness what love could accomplish when people chose to stand together. Tom Bradley lingered, helping to reinforce the shelter. You know, he said quietly, I came here thinking you were just a stubborn old fool. But tonight I saw what my Aunt Martha has been trying to tell me for years. Sometimes the heart knows truths that science can't measure. Eleanor always said that, Henry replied, his voice hoarse from singing and crying and commands. She said the distance between possible and impossible was exactly the length of one act of faith. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold Eleanor would have called God's watercolors. 3 tiny spotted bodies nursed successfully while their mother's purr rumbled contentment despite her ordeal. The contaminated water still poisoned the land. The legal issues remained unresolved, and Grace's future was uncertain. But in that moment, with new life breathing where death had seemed certain, with a community united where division had ruled, with love triumphing over a legacy of mistakes, Henry understood what Eleanor had been trying to teach him all along. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing to nurture life in spite of it. The euphoria of successful delivery lasted exactly 43 minutes. Henry noticed it first. The pooling of blood beneath Grace that wasn't stopping, wasn't normal. The morning sun, which had seemed like such a blessing moments before, now illuminated a growing crimson stain spreading across the makeshift bedding. Sarah, he called, his voice tight with renewed fear. Something's wrong. Sarah moved quickly, her professional assessment taking only seconds. She's hemorrhaging, post-delivery bleeding, without oxytocin or surgical intervention. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Grace was dying. After everything, the miles traveled while pregnant, the trust given, the successful delivery of 3 perfect cubs, she was bleeding out on a bed of hay and human kindness, beyond the reach of modern veterinary medicine. Can't we get her to a clinic? Tom Bradley asked, though his engineering mind already knew the answer. Moving her now would kill her faster, Sarah replied, her young face etched with frustration at her own limitations. I need specialized drugs, equipment I don't have. The nearest emergency veterinary hospital equipped for large exotic animals is in Madrid, 2 hours by car, and she wouldn't survive the first 20 minutes of transport. The cubs, oblivious to their mother's crisis, mewed plaintively, seeking her warmth and milk. Grace tried to respond, turning her head toward them. But the effort cost her. Her breathing became shallower, her eyes beginning to lose focus. Henry ran. At 72, with knees that protested and lungs that burned, he ran to Eleanor's veterinary shed with the desperation of a man half his age. His hands shook as he tore through shelves, scattering supplies that hadn't been touched in 5 years. Eleanor had kept everything meticulously organized, but grief had frozen it all in time like a museum of lost purpose. Behind a box of surgical supplies, he found Eleanor's emergency medical bag, the one she'd always kept packed for field emergencies. His fingers fumbled with the clasps, and when it opened, a letter fell out, his name written across it in Eleanor's careful script. The date stopped his heart. March 8, 2019. 1 week before she died. My darling Henry, he read, his vision blurring with tears. If you're reading this, it means Grace has come home. I knew she would, during her recovery 10 years ago. I noticed signs. She was pregnant then, though she lost the litter due to her injuries. The trauma would have left scarring that makes future pregnancies dangerous. She'll remember this place as safety. She'll come back when she needs us most. The letter continued. In this bag, You'll find everything I could prepare. It's not enough. It never is. But remember what I taught you. Sometimes the best medicine is refusing to give up. Grace trusted me once. She'll trust you if you show her the same steady love. Save her. Henry, not for me, but for what she represents. The wild spirit that refuses to be extinguished. The connection between our world and theirs. And forgive yourself for the poisoned water. I've known for 2 years. It wasn't your fault. You were trying to save the center. Save Grace instead. Henry's legs nearly gave out. Eleanor had known. She'd known about the contamination, about his failure, and she'd loved him anyway. She'd spent her final days preparing for a possibility she wouldn't live to see. He grabbed the bag and ran back, finding the scene worse than he'd left it. Grace's breathing had become irregular. The cubs were crying consistently now, their instincts telling them something was terribly wrong. The crowd of helpers stood helplessly, their earlier triumph transformed into collective anguish. "What's in the bag?" Sarah asked urgently. Henry pulled out vials, bandages, and instruments. But Sarah's expression grew more desperate with each item. "These are good, but without proper clotting agents, without surgical capability. Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry. I'm just a student. I don't know how to save her with what we have." "We're going to lose them all," Martha said quietly, voicing what everyone was thinking. Without their mother, the cubs would need specialized formula, round-the-clock feeding, expertise none of them possessed. That's when Dorothy Campbell's ancient Buick pulled up, the car's arrival announced by its characteristic wheeze and backfire. The 80-year-old woman who'd been supposedly bedridden emerged with surprising agility, carrying a wooden crate that looked as old as she was. "Out of my way," she commanded, and people parted like the Red Sea. She approached Grace without fear, setting down her crate to reveal bottles of goat milk, feeding supplies, and medications that hadn't been manufactured in decades. "This was my daughter's," she said simply. "Rebecca died at 3 days old. 52 years ago this month. I've kept her feeding supplies all this time. Don't ask me why." Her voice cracked slightly. "Maybe I was waiting for this moment. Won't watch babies die again. Not when I can help." She pulled out a vial of something Sarah didn't recognize. "Shepherd's purse tincture," Dorothy explained. "Old remedy for hemorrhaging. My grandmother was a midwife. Delivered hundreds of babies when doctors were scarce. She saved women with this when nothing else worked." She looked at Sarah. "It's not veterinary approved, probably not legal, definitely not scientific, but it works." Sarah hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before taking the vial. "How much for her size?" "The whole bottle, under the tongue if you can manage it, or mixed with water and misted on her gums." Working together, Sarah and Henry administered the tincture while Dorothy began preparing bottles for the cubs. Grace was barely conscious now, but she managed to open her eyes when Henry spoke her name. "Fight," he told her. "Eleanor fought for 3 months when the doctors gave her 3 weeks. You can fight for 3 cubs who need their mother." "We'll help, but you have to want it." Grace's response was weak but unmistakable. She turned her head toward her cubs, focusing on them with tremendous effort. The smallest one, the female with the white spot, had crawled closer to her mother's face, making tiny sounds that seemed to say, "Don't leave." "She wants to nurse them," Sarah observed. "If we can support her, the nursing might actually help with the hemorrhaging, oxytocin release." It took 4 people to carefully position Grace, supporting her weight so she could nurse without expending energy she didn't have. The cubs latched on immediately, their tiny bodies vibrating with the urgency of survival. Grace's eyes remained open, watching them with fierce maternal love that transcended her body's failure. For 20 minutes, she nursed them. The hemorrhaging slowed but didn't stop. Dorothy's tincture was buying time, not providing a cure. Grace seemed to understand this. When the cubs had fed, she did something that broke every heart present. With tremendous effort, she nudged each cub toward Henry, one at a time. First the largest male, then the smaller male, And finally the tiny female with the white spot. She looked at each human helper. Tom, who'd overcome his skepticism. Martha, who'd organized the impossible. Sarah, who'd done everything her training allowed. Father Miguel, who'd provided spiritual comfort. Sheriff Cole, who'd chosen compassion over law. Dorothy, who'd shared her deepest pain to help. But her longest look was reserved for Henry. In that gaze was recognition, gratitude, and something else, a transfer of responsibility. She was entrusting him with what she valued most. "No," Henry said, his voice breaking. "Don't you give up. We've come too far. Eleanor wouldn't let you give up." Grace's response was to place her paw on his hand, the same gesture she'd made hours earlier, but weaker now. Then she closed her eyes. "She's stopped breathing," Sarah announced, immediately beginning chest compressions. "Henry, breathe for her. 2 breaths every 30 compressions." Henry sealed his mouth over Grace's nostrils, breathing life into lungs that had given up. Sarah worked with professional efficiency, but her youth showed in the tears streaming down her face. The crowd formed a circle, some praying, others simply bearing witness. Father Miguel stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of faith. "Lord, we stand before you with one of your creatures, a mother who traveled impossible miles to find safety for her children. She trusted in human kindness when she had every reason not to. If it be your will, grant her more time with the cubs she fought so hard to bring into this world. Please," Henry whispered between rescue breaths. "Eleanor, if you're watching, if you have any influence wherever you are, help us. You saved her once. Help me save her now." For 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours, they worked. Sarah's compressions never faltered, though her arms trembled with exhaustion. Henry breathed for Grace until he was dizzy, spots dancing in his vision. The cubs cried for their mother, their voices a tiny chorus of need that pierced everyone present. Sheriff Cole found himself holding one of the cubs, the larger male, trying to comfort it while tears he'd never admit to rolled down his weathered face. Tom Bradley held another, the engineer who'd started this journey with skepticism now cradling new life with infinite tenderness. Martha took the smallest female, humming the same hymn they'd sung during the storm. Dorothy prepared more tincture, her ancient hands steady despite the circumstances. "Sometimes," she said to no one in particular, "love isn't enough, but sometimes it's all we have." As the sun climbed higher, warming Grace's still form, Henry felt the weight of another failure crushing him. He'd poisoned the water. He'd failed the conservation center. He'd been too late to save Eleanor. And now, despite everyone's efforts, he was going to fail Grace too. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her still form. "I'm so sorry for everything." Tom Bradley found them by accident. He'd been searching the veterinary shed for anything that might help when a loose floorboard caught his foot. Beneath it lay a manila folder wrapped in plastic, marked, "For Henry, only if necessary," in Eleanor's handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened it, scanning the contents with growing disbelief. Water quality reports dated 5 years ago, chemical analysis, EPA complaint forms, filled out but never sent, and a letter to Henry that Eleanor had never delivered. "Mr. Morrison," Tom called, his voice cutting through the desperate scene around Grace's still form. "You need to see this." Henry looked up from where he knelt beside Grace, his face ravaged by exhaustion and grief. Sarah had just stopped compressions after 10 minutes without response. Grace lay motionless, her 3 cubs crying plaintively nearby. "Not now," Henry said brokenly. "Yes, now," Tom insisted, bringing the papers over. "Eleanor knew about the contamination 5 years ago. She knew everything." The words hit Henry like physical blows as Tom read Eleanor's undelivered letter aloud. "My beloved Henry, I discovered the barrel leak 6 months ago during one of my morning walks. I had the water tested privately. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I tell you? Because you would have blamed yourself, and the guilt would have destroyed you. You were trying to save the conservation center, trying to keep dozens of people employed. The decision to store those barrels was made from desperation. not negligence. Martha took the letter from Tom, shaking hands, continuing to read. I've spent our savings, all $47,000, hiring an environmental consultant to develop a cleanup plan. It's comprehensive, ready to implement. I was going to surprise you for our anniversary, tell you it was handled. But then came my diagnosis. Sarah gasped. Look at this, she said, pointing to a medical document in the folder. Her oncologist's notes. He suspected environmental toxin exposure as a contributing factor to her pancreatic cancer. She must have been exposed while investigating the contamination. She chose to save the land over aggressive treatment, Dorothy Campbell said quietly, reading another page. Says here she refused the experimental therapy that might have given her another year because the money needed to go to the cleanup. Oh, Henry. Henry couldn't speak. Eleanor had known everything, had sacrificed everything, and had still spent her final days preparing for Grace's eventual return. The last entry in her veterinary notes, dated 3 days before her death, read, Grace will come back pregnant. The scarring from her original injuries will make delivery dangerous. Henry will blame himself for the poisoned water. Don't let him. Tell him the truth. Love means choosing life over guilt. Always. There's more, Tom said, pulling out detailed environmental remediation plans. She mapped every contamination point, calculated flow rates, identified natural filtration points. This is doctoral-level work. It would have taken her months. Father Miguel crossed himself. She spent her dying months saving the land instead of herself. And Grace was her last patient, Sarah noted, finding a treatment log. The day before Eleanor entered hospice, she treated an injured fox, gave antibiotics to a sick owl, and wrote detailed notes about Grace's probable return. Her last medical act was preparing that emergency bag you found. Dorothy Campbell had been strangely quiet during these revelations, standing over Grace's still form with an expression of deep concentration. Suddenly, she knelt beside the motionless Cheetah with surprising agility for her 80 years. She's not dead, Dorothy announced. Look carefully. There's still the faintest heartbeat. She's in what my grandmother called the space between. Not alive enough to fight, not dead enough to let go. There's nothing more we can do, Sarah said helplessly. We've tried everything. Not everything, Dorothy replied, pulling something from her ancient medical bag. This is insane. Probably illegal, and might kill her outright. But my grandmother used it on a farmer once who'd drowned and been pulled out after 20 minutes underwater. Everyone said he was gone. She stung him with a bee. The venom shock restarted his heart. That's not medical science, Sarah protested. Neither was Eleanor spending her last strength preparing for a cheetah that might never return. Dorothy shot back. Sometimes faith requires us to act beyond science. She held up a small jar containing 3 live bees. I keep them for my arthritis, bee venom therapy. It's controversial, but it works for me. The venom contains melittin, which can trigger adrenaline production. In the right amount, it's a natural defibrillator. You could kill her, Tom warned. She's already gone by conventional standards, Dorothy replied. But Henry, this is your choice. Eleanor trusted you to save Grace. What would she do? Henry looked at Grace's still form, at her 3 cubs now being held by various helpers, at the community that had gathered to fight the impossible. Eleanor would have tried anything, everything, would have refused to accept defeat until the last possible option was exhausted. Do it, he said. Dorothy worked with the precision of someone who'd done this before, though she hadn't, not on an animal this size. She selected a specific spot on Grace's chest, near the heart, but not directly over it. Hold her cubs where she can smell them, she instructed. Sarah and Martha brought the cubs close to Grace's nose. The smallest female with the white spot mewed directly into her mother's ear, a sound of pure need that seemed to echo in the morning air. Dorothy positioned the bee carefully, using tweezers. Forgive me, she whispered to Grace, then allowed the bee to sting. For 10 seconds, Nothing happened. Then Grace's body convulsed, a single, powerful spasm that made everyone step back. Her eyes flew open, unfocused and wild. She gasped, a rattling breath that sounded like it was dragged from the depths of the earth itself. "Again," Dorothy said, already positioning a second bee. "She needs one more. Trust me." The second sting produced another convulsion, but this time Grace's breathing followed, ragged, painful, but consistent. Her eyes began to focus, first on the sky, then on the faces around her, finally on her cubs. "Keep her still," Sarah commanded, switching instantly back into medical mode. "The hemorrhaging has stopped, but she's incredibly fragile. Any sudden movement could undo everything." Grace tried to lift her head toward her cubs, but Henry gently held her down. "They're safe," he assured her. "All three, healthy and perfect. You did it. Grace, you brought them into the world. Now let us help you stay in it with them." For the next hour, they worked in coordinated silence. Dorothy's goat milk was given to the cubs when they cried. Sarah monitored Grace's vitals, amazed to find them slowly stabilizing. Tom and Sheriff Cole reinforced the shelter, creating a more permanent structure. Martha coordinated volunteers to maintain the water misting system, and then Sheriff Cole made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He called the State Environmental Protection Agency, but not about Grace. "I need to report contamination at the old Wild Heart Conservation Site," he said into his phone, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I discovered it during a routine patrol. 3 barrels of veterinary chemicals, been leaking for years. We need an emergency response team." He paused, listening, then continued. No animals involved. The area's been abandoned for years. Just needs immediate cleanup to prevent spread." When he hung up, he looked at Henry. "They'll be here in 2 hours. I suggest Grace and her cubs be somewhere else by then. Officially. I never saw any cheetahs. Unofficially. The Morrison property is about to get a complete environmental cleanup at state expense, using the plans they'll discover in the Conservation Center office." "Cole, Henry began. "Save it, Morrison. Your wife gave everything to fix this. Least we can do is make sure her plan gets implemented without you going to prison for unauthorized hazardous waste storage." Father Miguel had been reading more of Eleanor's papers. "Henry, look at this. She didn't just plan the cleanup. She contacted a wildlife sanctuary in Portugal, one that specializes in cheetah rehabilitation. They agreed to take Grace and any cubs when the time came. The paperwork is all here, dated 2 weeks before she died." "She thought of everything," Martha said wonderingly. "She knew Henry would need a clear path forward," Dorothy said, still monitoring Grace carefully. "Love isn't just feeling. It's planning for the future you won't see." As the sun reached its zenith, Grace managed to nurse her cubs again. The smallest female seemed particularly vigorous, climbing over her siblings to claim the best position. Grace watched them with eyes that held exhaustion, but also fierce determination. Henry sat beside her, reading more of Eleanor's letter. "Tell Grace I kept my promise. The water will be clean again. Her cubs will drink from pure streams, and tell her thank you for trusting me once, and for trusting you when she returns. You're stronger than you know, my love. Save her. Save yourself. Choose life." Day 8 dawned with Grace's eyes open, clear and focused for the first time since her collapse. Her first look went to her cubs, counting each one with maternal precision. Her second settled on Henry, holding something deeper than gratitude, recognition of shared loss, shared love, shared purpose. When she attempted to stand, everyone rushed forward, but she managed it alone, wobbly but determined. By day 15, Grace had recovered enough to walk the yard, her cubs tumbling after her in spotted chaos. The Portuguese sanctuary Eleanor had contacted confirmed they could accommodate the family. The town divided sharply, some saying Henry should keep them, others insisting wild animals needed proper facilities. "It's not our choice," Henry said at the impromptu town meeting in his yard. It never was. The transport arrived on a morning so similar to the one when Grace first appeared that Henry's chest ached. Grace seemed to understand what was happening. She walked toward the open carrier, then stopped. One by one, she carried each cub to Henry, setting them at his feet, allowing him to stroke their small heads. The smallest female, the one with Eleanor's marking, climbed onto his lap, purring with infant contentment. Grace watched this, then gently took the cub back in her mouth. She entered the carrier willingly, but at the threshold, she turned. The look she gave Henry lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it contained everything. Acknowledgement of Eleanor's absence, gratitude for Henry's presence, understanding that love sometimes means letting go. Then she disappeared into the carrier's darkness. Day 30 brought a video from the sanctuary. Grace lounged in the sun while her cubs played, the smallest female pouncing on her brothers with particular determination. The sanctuary had named her Eleanor. Henry no longer ate dinner alone, hosting weekly gatherings for those who'd helped. The table Eleanor had set for 2 now seated 12. Martha arrived with news that afternoon. The spring tested clean. Tom confirmed it. Eleanor's remediation plan worked perfectly. 6 months later, the Eleanor Morrison Wildlife Fund held its first board meeting at the reopened Wild Heart Conservation Center. Sarah Williams had accepted the position of head veterinarian. Sheriff Cole sat on the board of directors. Dorothy Campbell, despite insisting she was too old for such nonsense, had become the primary donor. Father Miguel blessed the grounds while Tom Bradley designed new, safe storage facilities. That evening, Henry stood at Eleanor's stone fence as sunset painted the Spanish hills gold. He no longer looked for Grace. He knew she was safe, wild, free. But sometimes, in the wind through the rocks, he heard Eleanor's laugh, and he knew, with certainty beyond reason, that somewhere Grace heard it too. Love never truly dies. It just learns to speak in different languages, across species, across time, until every heartbeat becomes a translation of what we couldn't say goodbye to. I need to tell you something about this story, something I've learned from watching Henry's journey unfold. We spend our lives building fences, between ourselves and nature, between our hearts and our neighbors, between who we are and who we could become. Henry's fence was built from grief, but Grace didn't see a barrier. She saw Eleanor's promise written in stone. Family isn't just blood or species. It's the rancher who hated predators holding up a tarp in a storm. It's the sheriff choosing mercy over law. It's an 80-year-old woman sharing her deepest pain to save 3 cubs. When Grace placed her paw on Henry's hand, she wasn't just saying thank you. She was saying, you are mine now, as I am yours. Gratitude transcends words. Grace couldn't speak her thanks, but she gave Henry something greater, trust in her most vulnerable moment, the privilege of touching new life, the gift of purpose when his own had died with Eleanor. She reminded him that love doesn't end with loss. It transforms, spreads, creates unlikely families from broken hearts. Sometimes the universe sends us exactly what we need disguised as what we fear most. Grace came seeking water but gave Henry redemption. That's the truest gratitude, showing someone they still matter when they've forgotten how to believe it themselves.